Hello, I'm Nick Spencer, and you're listening to a new series of Reading Our Times, the podcast about books, about ideas about us. This series, we're looking at playing God, science, religion, and the future of humanity. We're going to be talking about scientific immortality, alien life, animal personhood, the rise in mental ill health, and the soul of AI. And underlying it all, we're going to be thinking about the question that lies at the heart of Reading Our Times. How are we to understand our human condition? The desire to live forever is not a new one. Indeed, there's hardly a culture in history that hasn't fantasised about it. And many would claim that it is this desire that lies at the heart of the world's religions. Recently, however, the landscape of immortality has begun to be colonised by a new figure, the scientist. Yes, science has got in on the act of living forever. In truth, it's been there for a while. Cryonics, the process of freezing and then one day, hopefully, thawing out humans, has been around for half a century. For those, however, who aren't so keen on having their newly deceased corpse pumped full of liquid nitrogen and stored upside down in a freezer, new options are coming online. Some offer the potential to extend human life, sometimes by a radical number of years, and some even claim to go the whole hog and offer humans real immortality, augmented or uploaded or virtualised. It may not appeal, not yet, but when the Joneses next door start their gene therapy that offers them another 80 years of healthy life, will you be able to resist? Who wants to live forever? Or for a very long time? What would it mean for ourselves, for society, for the planet? Above all, should we want this? Because if not, why is it that so many people and so many cultures do? Stephen Cave is director of the Institute for Technology and Humanity at the University of Cambridge, and together with the philosopher and his disputant John Martin Fisher, has co-written an argumentative new book entitled Should You Choose to Live Forever? Stephen, welcome to Reading Our Times.
Hi Nick, thank you very much for having me.
It's worth pointing out that your book is actually a debate between yourself and another philosopher, John Martin Fisher, so I guess I'm going to be playing the role of your adversary a bit in this discussion. The book is also called Should You Choose to Live Forever. But before we get to the should, I wanted to talk a little bit about the could, because there's an awful lot of money and energy being poured into the objective of scientific immortality at the moment. Could you give us just a brief tour of what's going on? What are they trying to achieve?
Yes, well, people, of course, have always dreamed of living forever. This has always been one of the goals of science. There have been many attempts, but these failed, of course. The 20th century is littered with the failed careers of people who, on the back of having established reputations as scientists, then made these extravagant promises. Linus Pauling won 2 Nobel Prizes, brilliant biochemist. In his latter years, wrote his book saying vitamin C would help us live forever. Of course, it doesn't. And, it destroyed his reputation. And because of that, over the course of the 20th century, anti-aging research really fell into disrepute and was associated with quackery. But, of course, biochemical research continued to advance, and there really were a number of incredibly significant breakthroughs. It was the end of the last century, beginning of this one, sequencing the human genome, for example, and interventions that in what they call animal models, so nematode worms or fruit flies or even more complex animals, mammals like mice, really have extended lifespan. And because of that, people are really excited again now about the possibilities of slowing aging. And also, scientists, doctors have realised increasingly that now people are living longer. The kind of things people are dying from, like cancer and dementia and heart disease, are very much considered diseases of aging. That is, they're tightly bound with the aging process itself. So increasingly, scientists and doctors are thinking, OK, we shouldn't just look at separating these out and tackling lung cancer or heart disease. We have to think about the whole picture. If we can stop our body from undergoing these aging processes, maybe we can stop all of these diseases, or at least significantly slow them down. So there's a lot of money now going into things like cellular rejuvenation. I'm sure many listeners will have heard of stem cells, so cells that can produce new cells, new tissues, crucially important as we're growing in the womb and throughout childhood. But adults have stem cells too, but they become less effective. They age, they even die or become ejected by the body. And so some people put their hopes in reversing the aging of those cells or introducing new stem cells in order for our body to be able to repair itself and produce new tissue.
So that's really interesting. So there's cellular techniques, there are genetic techniques, aren't there, in terms of knocking out particular genes that are associated with aging. And also, which is the one that tends to grab headlines, there's the kind of transhumanist attempt at eternal life where we kind of digitize ourselves or upload our mind, which are rather fantastical. But that doesn't mean that people aren't investing in them at the moment, does it?
Absolutely. This is a very rapidly growing industry. So it's something that certain communities, as you say, with transhumanists, who are sort of techno-utopians, if you like, have been thinking about for a long time. And for them, it's kind of a plan C. So, plan A is very much take your vitamins, do your exercise, stay alive as long as you can. Plan B might be, well, if it's inevitable we're going to die because we haven't had the right kind of breakthroughs quickly enough, then maybe we can freeze ourselves and be thawed out later, as is cryonics, and then benefit from advances in science and technology. But if we think, no, either that's not going to work and bodies are just way too unreliable, we're never going to fix them in a satisfactory way, then let's upload ourselves onto machines instead, as you described.
So that's could we or might we possibly be able to one day? The question we're here to talk about is should we? In advance of answering that, you helpfully split the forever in the title of your book into different meanings. Tell us about those.
Yeah, well, the question of whether we should or shouldn't live forever is an age-old one, but the arguments get very mixed up. So I suggest 4 categories for thinking about the forever part of living forever. The first is modest or moderate life extension, and that would be, as I categorise it, something like living to between 120 and 160 years. And I've chosen those dates because 120 is about the longest any human has ever lived. And 160 would be a doubling of the current life expectancy in developed countries, which is 80. And then we can talk about more extreme, more radical life extension, which is where we effectively defeat aging and disease. So, imagine we've got all this cellular reprogramming, your liver fails, fine, we'll grow you a new one. So all of the kind of ailments that have cut down humans in the past just don't apply. And it's very hard to predict how long people would live in the conditions of radical life extension because effectively they could still be killed and they would be killed by accidents. So in the US, where there are more shootings and more traffic deaths and so on, life expectancy would be much lower than in safety-conscious Japan, whereas you might think in other ways are very, comparable, similar societies. So those, I think, are 2 timescales we can aspire to through medical technology. But as I say, the debate about living forever encompasses also much more, shall we say, metaphysical options. And those I call immortality. And I've got 2 categories of those. But in both cases, it's genuinely possible we could live forever. In the case of radical life extension, it isn't possible. Eventually, you'll get struck by lightning, a piano will fall on your head, the sun will grow and consume the earth. We're not talking about forever. But let's imagine scenarios where we are, and one I call contingent immortality, which is where, yes, you could live forever, but it's contingent on something else, whether it's the will of a god or, taking a certain kind of potion or what have you. And then true immortality, which is where you're just not the kind of thing that can die. Like death isn't an option. Even if you wanted to be, it wouldn't be an option.
Yeah.
Although that might sound extraordinary, the vast majority of people through history have believed something like that. Because if you think you're a soul, you think the real you isn't this body, but is a soul, and a soul isn't the kind of thing that can be destroyed, then you think you are a true immortal. Yep. So those are the 4 categories I think we need to separate out. That's moderate life extension, radical life extension, contingent immortality and true immortality in order to make sense of these arguments.
It's a very helpful distinction, and we will come back to it when we talk about the pros and the cons. There's one other important distinction that you draw early on, which I think is very relevant to this whole debate, which is the distinction between prudential reasoning and ethical reasoning. Briefly tell us how those 2 are different.
Yeah, so when we're asking ourselves, should we do a thing, there are 2 quite different ways in which we might mean that. We might mean, is it good for me to do a thing? Should I go to the cinema or stay home? Well, if I'm asking which one would be best for me, which one would I enjoy most? These are questions about what is good for each of us as individuals. And a lot of the debate about immortality has been about that kind of reasoning. Would it be boring? And so on. But there's another really important meaning of should, which is, of course, the ethical dimension. And this is, I think, under-examined in the literature on immortality and living forever. But in particular, if we're thinking about living forever on this world, then there are a whole set of enormously important ethical questions. So these are questions about what would us living forever mean, not just for each of us as individuals, whether it be fun or not, but what does it mean for society? What does it mean for our relationship to the planet? What does it mean for future generations and so on? So those are the more ethical questions.
In the debate with John Fisher, it should be pointed out right up front, you're the no. You're the we shouldn't choose to live forever. And you list out in your contributions various prudential and ethical reasons. I was chatting with you before we went live about how I found those very persuasive, and then I read some of John Fisher's and I found those very persuasive. And so I hope listeners might kind of oscillate between the two positions as we pursue the conversation. But before I kind of push back on some of your reasons, give me some of your prudential reasons why we shouldn't live forever.
Well, the classic one that everyone worries about is boredom. Is it possible? We're finite beings with finite interests in a finite world. Is it possible for us to really stay happy and motivated forever? And in the literature on whether we should live forever, the consensus seems to be no. There are many, many skeptics. And I think that's because we all experience boredom in our lives. I mean, boredom might not be quite the right word. It's the word that's often used in the literature. But if you look at, a classic example, such as Karel Čapek's play, The Macropolis Case, which deals with a woman who takes an elixir of life and she becomes an opera singer. She's incredibly successful, has to keep changing her identity over the centuries so as not to arouse suspicion. And the play is about how she becomes cold and indifferent to the world. And really, if we look at her state, it isn't just boredom. It's something more like what we might call ennui or melancholy. She says, you people, you don't even understand. I guess we might think of, we experience boredom in our lives for waiting in a shopping queue, but we get to the end, we feel fine again. I think what we're talking about when we're worrying about living forever is something much deeper. It's more like, sure, you're bored in the cinema queue, but if you go and watch this great film and afterwards you still don't feel any better, that's not boredom, that's ennui, it's melancholy, it's depression. And it's worth bearing in mind that millions, hundreds of millions of people on the planet right now suffer from depression. Yes. There are many hundreds of millions of people who are not happy with their current lives. So saying we should extend them, is a bit like the Woody Allen joke of, two women talking and one says, the food here is terrible. And the other one says, yeah, and the portions are so small. Why would you want more if it's so terrible? Of course, we're not all bored. We're not all depressed. But the reasoning, the argument is that eventually, inevitably, we would become so.
You quote that lovely line from Susan Ertz, millions long for immortality who don't know what to do themselves on a rainy Sunday afternoon. And I guess the vision you're painting out there, that however much it might appeal at first, ultimately eternity would be one very, very long rainy Sunday afternoon, right? Exactly.
Now, of course, John comes back and says, well, that's how it might seem in rainy Cambridge. And he points to a long tradition of curmudgeonly English philosophers.
And he's in California, isn't that right?
He's in California,
I can see the difference
which,
there, yeah.
for a long time has been associated with this kind of very utopian, optimistic thinking about living forever, about how we can use technology and so on. So it was a kind of clash of cultures and clash of ideologies underlying this philosophical debate.
Let's look at the ethical reasons for your case. You basically split them out into two. One is overpopulation and one is social justice. Tell us about those.
Well, one thing that I try to do in this book is lay out not just the arguments against living forever, but also the relationships between them. And I think it's particularly clear with overpopulation and social injustice. So first, overpopulation. I mean, this is very straightforward. And again, it's one of the first arguments people think of when they think about living forever, particularly in this world. Of course, if you think we're going to go to heaven, then it's a different kind of space and we're going to live on there, then different arguments apply. But if we're going to live forever on this world, then it will fill up. It's clear that every environment has what's called a carrying capacity. That is a certain number of individuals that it can support. Many people think that we've reached or exceeded our carrying capacity of the planet for humans. I mean, not everyone thinks that. It's controversial. But, of course, we are experiencing climate change and massive biodiversity loss. Clearly, we're wreaking havoc. Maybe we'll be able to get ourselves out of it, but clearly we already are with the 8 billion or so of us that there are now. So if people stop dying, but they continue to be born, then we'll have a massive population explosion. Well, okay, people come back and say, well, maybe people will stop having children. And maybe they will. There is some evidence to support that. It is true that more prosperous societies, those of Europe, Japan, Korea, for example, they have much lower fertility rates. But many people, and I'm one of them, consider having children to be a fundamental part of a meaningful life. Not for everyone, of course, but for me, I would be devastated. Full disclosure, I have 3 daughters. That would be devastating.
But also, I mean, as a human species, you could argue that this is a fundamental good for us. This is what we're evolved to do. It seems hard, even if fertility rates are falling, and they're very, very low in places like South Korea at the moment. It seems hard to imagine us ever shifting the deep-rooted desire to have children.
I agree, and that therefore conjures a very dystopian vision of society where there are some people who desperately want to have children, and either they're deeply unhappy because they're prevented, or they try to, and then the government will need to engage in mass forced sterilization, mass forced abortion, infanticide. This doesn't sound like the kind of utopian society we were hoping for.
The other point you make is social justice, whereby that kind of immortality is only offered to a small, select, brackets, rich handful of people, right?
Exactly. And the link between the two is that some people say, well, overpopulation won't be a problem because these treatments will be incredibly expensive and only available, therefore, to the rich. So that's all right then. Well, of course, it isn't all right because that will exacerbate social injustice. And in lots of ways. I mean, already we think that different people having different life expectancies is unjust. So, in the UK where I live, every now and again it's reported that people in the south live longer than people in the north, or richer people versus poorer people, people of certain ethnicities. And it's always with a strong sense of injustice. This is wrong. Something must be done. Government policies are introduced to try to level this. And that's just for the life expectancy difference of maybe up to 10 years, difference between 70 and 80.
Yeah.
Now imagine instead if it was a difference between 80 and 180. So I think we would find the idea that some people are effectively immortal, while the rest of us sort of come and go like flies, completely unacceptable.
That's a weird reversion to the kind of classical notion of the gods, isn't it? Where you have these bunch of basically superhumans that carry on forever and the rest of us live and die like flies.
Exactly. And like gods, they would be able to accumulate huge amounts of power. We already have long-lived billionaires and politicians, think of Vladimir Putin, who have accumulated vast amounts of resources, vast amounts of power, and the longer they stick around, the more they can accumulate.
I have to say, when I think of the various attempts by Silicon Valley billionaires to push towards extreme life extension, it is these ethical considerations that I think are pretty much unanswerable. I mean, it's all very well giving extreme life extension to some rich people in California, brackets, it's unjust, but you can see how a planet would sustain it. But not thinking through what that would mean for the rest of us, it seems to me to be a catastrophe waiting to happen, that one.
I agree. And this can be a difficult message to convey because these people are optimistic. They feel that they're investing in medical and biotechnological research that is surely good for us. And in a way it is. And so my message to them is not stop trying to come up with anti-aging remedies. Anti-aging remedies could alleviate enormous amounts of suffering. But rather, while we're thinking about these technologies, be thinking also about the consequences.
Yeah, exactly. And this is the kind of the classic distinction between thinking about me and thinking about us, isn't it? One of the things I really liked about the book, and this is where I'm going to return to the prudential reasoning and maybe push back a bit against it. One of the things I really liked is the way that you and John draw on literary examples, which is a fantastic way of stimulating our imagination and thinking through these things. And I want to put one to you that I've come across when writing on this subject, which is very similar to several of the ones that you raise, but slightly distinct. It's from Julian Barnes's novel, A History of the World in 10.5 chapters. Now, I don't know if you know, there's a chapter, or it might even be the parenthesis, right at the end of the book, called A Dream. in which he basically wakes up in heaven. And he can live forever and get anything he likes. And spoiler alert to anyone who hasn't read the book, he decides to switch himself off after a very, very long period of time. It's a brilliant piece of writing. And he's reasoning at the end about why he decides to do that. And he says, you can't become someone else without stopping being who you are. And nobody can bear that. And the reason he's saying that is because he is the kind of person that likes fast cars and loose women and wine and women and song and all the rest of it. And as his host says, they're the kind of people that usually switch themselves off soonest, the hedonists. And he said, well, can't I transform that, go through that? And he said, no, you have to basically become somebody else. And he says at the end, it seems to me that heaven's a very good idea. It's the perfect idea, you could say, but not for us, not given the way we are. Now, I think that's a really interesting dimension in all this. And you touch on it several times, the idea of transformation, about whether we're talking about living forever as the kind of species that we are, which has probably limited appeal, or living forever as a kind of transformed species. Doesn't that change the parameters of the debate?
Oh, that's a really lovely example. So thank you for reminding me of it. I read that book when I was about 19, which was literally in a different millennium.
Same here, actually,
yes. So no, that's a great example, and I think does capture something really important particularly for religious conceptions or otherworldly conceptions of immortality, like living forever in heaven. And of course, this is an age-old debate. I mean, we see this debate in the Bible. Jesus engages in this debate in the Bible. Correct me if I'm wrong. I think Pharisees who are debating...
It's probably the Sadducees, I think, who don't believe in eternal life.
Yeah. Right, thank you for that. It's a series of brothers who each die, and the wife of the first one then marries each one sequentially, and the question is whose wife will she be in heaven?
Yes.
And this is sometimes called the anthropocentric view of heaven, that is human-centred. It's the idea of heaven, it'll be great, I'll get to have tea with my long-deceased grandma and fulfill all these other kind of wishes. And of course, that's riddled with contradictions, as was known 2,000 years ago, as we see in this debate. I dream of going to heaven and having tea with my grandma, but my grandma wants to ride around in a Ferrari, doesn't want anything to do with me. So, it's riddled with contradictions. And so more sophisticated theologians, well, like Jesus himself, so say, no, it won't be like that. We'll be transformed into angel-like beings and so on, or we'll worship at the throne of God, singing hymns to him for eternity, and that just will be joyful. And what's interesting is it feels a bit like the theologians are just waving the problem away. They're recognizing that beings like us, with all of our contradictions and conflicts, cannot live happily forever, not blissfully. That really it's more, we have to be kind of mesmerized into it. We have to become something different. We have to become like the angels. But if we're becoming something so different, something that's actually filled with joy just by, worshipping at the throne of God for eternity, have we not actually become something else? Would I still be me in any meaningful way?
And that's the fascinating thing. And I want to pick up on that idea of so different. I'm going to give you another literary quote here. It's from Middlemarch, the great George Eliot novel. And there's a moment in it when she writes of an artist whose name is Will Ladislaw. I think his own feelings at that moment were perfect. For we mortals have our divine moments when love is satisfied in the completeness of the beloved object. Now, of course, George Eliot, famously an evangelical who totally lost her faith and adapted a kind of humanism as a replacement. So she's not actually making an apologetic or religious point there. But I think that's a very telling and, to my mind, rather a beautiful point that we are mortals, but we have divine moments. And those moments are when love is satisfied in the completeness of the beloved object. In other words, that maybe we wouldn't be so different. Maybe that kind of transformation is the transformation that is still recognisably us, but it's a kind of growing of those quasi-divine moments in life. Do you see what I mean?
That's a really interesting thought. And I explore something a bit like it in an earlier book I wrote called Immortality, where I talk about the fear of death and how to address the fear of death. And I focus on a number of wisdom traditions, if you like, that you can find in many world religions in different ways, Christianity, Buddhism and so on, mysticism of various kinds. And they have themes like this very much in common. I draw out 3 in that book, which are focused less on yourself and more on others, focus more on the present and less on the future. As living beings, death is always in the future. This was an insight that the Greek philosopher Epicurus had. When I am here, death is not. When death is here, I am not. So, death is always just a future possibility. For as long as we remain in the present, we are focused on what we have here and now. And the third is gratitude. The third sort of virtue, if you like, for addressing the fear of death is rather than be fearful of death and the times when we will not be, instead be grateful for the incredibly unlikely truth that we are at all, that we've come into being. And I think those kind of moments that George Eliot's describing, where we're utterly in the moment, focused on our love for some other entity, whether it's a person, whether it's the natural world, whether it's our God, or so on, is a time when we're demonstrating all of those virtues. And it's a kind of stepping outside of time. It's a way of defeating the process of time and aging and debilitation and inevitability of death by stepping outside to something more eternal.
Well, I'm glad you picked that up, because I'm going to give you one more quotation, and I promise you I'll stop throwing quotations at you. This is a couple of lines from Wittgenstein's Tractatus. He says at one point in the 6th section, death is not an event in life, death is not lived through. If by eternity is understood not endless temporal duration, but timelessness, then he lives eternally, who lives in the present. I think there is something in that that's not dissimilar from the point you were making there and the point that George Eliot was making, whereby we naturally assume eternity is just an extension of what is going on now. Whereas, if you like, there can be an idea of eternity which is, I guess, more qualitative rather than quantitative. Does that make sense?
No, I love that quote, and I actually quote it in my other book, Immortality, because I think it's such a great way of capturing that Epicurean insight. When we see time in a linear way, as you were saying, sort of eternity as like more of the same, if you like, then of course we're looking ahead and what we're seeing is death and the end of ourselves and so on, and it fills us with dread. And what these thinkers, George Eliot, Wittgenstein, Epicurus, many others are trying to do is get us to focus instead on the present moment where death is necessarily absent. Wittgenstein talks about the death as the horizon beyond which we can't see. It depends on whether you think there's an afterlife and so on. But if you don't, death is not something we will ever experience. It doesn't make sense to fear something, this was Epicurus' point, we won't experience. They can't have any negative experiences attached to it. And if we focus instead on the present, then we experience the closest we can to a kind of immortality, a kind of joy in being that we will not experience ending.
Yes. John Fisher talks a bit about that, doesn't he, in his distinction between extractive pleasure and immersive pleasure, the latter being that kind of full flow experience of the now, whereas extractive is what we get out of it. Is that right?
Yes. So John is critical of an approach to life that he calls it extractive, that is, what can I get out of this? So I've got everything out of it I can. I'm going to move on to the next thing. And he advocates instead for certain states of being. He cites the idea of the flow state, which is very similar, I think, to these more mystical traditions, where we are so in the moment and immersed in what we're doing and one with what we are doing, whether it's meditating or, fixing a car, that the kind of rules don't apply of, boredom and procrastination, all these kind of worries. And I suppose where we differ is not in valuing those states or thinking they're possible. It's more that John thinks they're possible forever, and I'm more sceptical. But at the same time, I want to point out that the jury's out. We don't know. And it might also be true of some people and not others. We know the world has many different kinds of people, different kinds of personality. Some are already bored. Some don't know what to do on a Sunday afternoon, as we mentioned. Some are full of beans. Some might have refined these skills of meditation and transcendence or attaining a flow state and so on. So maybe immortality would be okay for them.
Yeah. I want to explore that particular distinction a bit more, because I guess there are two ways of looking at that. One is that there are certain people who are just glass half full, if you put it that way, and those who are glass half empty. And for the first bunch, eternity might be great big fun, but for the second bunch, it's just going to be one long wet Sunday afternoon. That seems to suggest you're that's almost Calvinist, isn't it? It seems to suggest that there are certain people who are born to this kind of stuff and others who aren't, and you can't do anything about it. But there is another approach, which is that actually what we can do as human beings is cultivate the kind of virtues and practices that would, as it were, make us more like the second group of people. Let me quote something that you wrote in the book. book, as with many worthwhile things in life, such as getting fit or mastering a musical instrument, his dream of becoming a medical doctor requires that he first forego present pleasure. But in an infinitely prolonged life, there will always be time to do that in a tomorrow that never comes. Now, you're making a point about procrastination there, but I wonder whether there's something we can draw from that about, look, if we haven't developed the kind of virtues that will make eternity tolerable, then it will by definition be intolerable. But as flexible, ethical, responsive, social beings, actually we can develop those virtues. Are you persuaded by that?
I think that's a great point. And I think, if we step outside of the more abstract philosophical debates about forever, about immortality, to thinking about life extension, then we face this challenge right now. People are living longer. Many more people are living to be into their 80s, up to 90, and so on. And there's a huge difference in life satisfaction between different demographics. So people who are better educated, for example, not only live longer and healthier, but have better life satisfaction. People who are giving opportunities to continue to contribute to society, to continue to learn, to develop new skills, and so on. So if we have a society that sees education as something you do when you're young and that's it, as work you do in your middle years and then you're done and you're no longer productive or useful for society, if we have a culture that's consumerist and based on buying new kit and doom-scrolling apps, etc., then people's longer lives are not going to be joy-filled.
Yeah.
But we can change that. We can both change the structure of our societies and our economies, our workplaces, and, as you say, give people the kind of virtues they need to genuinely enjoy longer lives.
Yeah. I mean, it's very redolent of the whole debate around retirement, isn't it? Whereby we kind of split life into this allegedly contributive part when we're working, and then we can kick back and relax on the beach. And yet so very, very many people find that vision of retirement is not paradise, and actually they find themselves in a state of ennui and boredom and frustration because they're not feeling that they're contributing in the way that they had done.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the evidence shows that our older years, which we tend to frame in our current Western society as years of decline and dependence, can actually be the happiest of our entire lives. When, people have paid off the mortgage, they've given up a lot of responsibilities, they have a good idea of what's important to them, what brings them joy and what doesn't, and so on. With the right kind of resources, these can be really, really happy years. But as you say, for too many people, that isn't the case. So now life extension really is a possibility. We need to, informed by these ancient philosophical debates, we need to bring them more into the real world, into these very practical questions.
Yeah, and I guess that's one of the key kind of carry homes from the debate in this book, at least for me, which is thinking about any kind of life extension, and the longer, the more serious, without framing it within these wider philosophical, ethical considerations is a kind of paving the way to hell, really, because combining supreme technological sophistication and the ability to manipulate genes with a kind of, without being too judgmental, a sort of anodyne or hedonistic culture is not a long-term recipe for happiness.
Well, I completely agree. And the other topic I like to work on is AI, where the same story applies, of course. Long-held fantasies of a utopia where we have these technologies, AI, life extension, and so on. Vast, mind-boggling sums of money, incredible amounts of talent going into developing them. And by comparison, minuscule fractions going into thinking about what it means for these technologies to go well. Yes. And in an era of incredibly rapid technological transformation, the risks are immense. And they're not just the kind of direct consequences of these technologies, in the case of AI, robot uprising, in the case of life extension, overpopulation. It's more of a kind of tipping point. A little bit of injustice here can swing an election, can bring in someone more dictatorial, can cause a democracy to collapse, civil war to arise. I mean, we're seeing these kinds of things already with the technologies we have, people living longer, certain industries being automated, and so on. So realizing the promise of these technologies and making them go well is going to require a lot more broader and interdisciplinary thinking than we're currently going into.
And a lot more attention to ourselves as well. Ironically, it's a lot more attention to our own virtues and practices and institutions and so on and so forth. A final question. One of the running themes throughout Reading Our Times interviews is human condition and what we've been talking about says about who we are and what we want. What's your takeaway from this extremely interesting and very helpful debate about radical life extension. What perspective does it give you on the kind of creatures that we are?
Yes, good question. Well, on the one hand, I think it shows both what is perennial in human nature and the human condition as it's developed over centuries, and what's changing. One of the perennials is that we're fundamentally technological beings. We've evolved through and with our technology. Technology is part of what we are. This is told wonderfully in the Prometheus myth, but also foundational now in science to thinking about the development of our species. So technology is part of what we are, and never before has technology changed faster and more fundamentally than right now. So that means a part of us is changing that fast. So that can feel terrifying. Exciting. It is worrying, it is risky, but it also is full of promise. And at the same time as that incredibly rapid change, there are many constants, like the fear of death, like the truths in these wisdom traditions about how to live meaningfully in the present, about the importance of connection and contemplation and virtues and so on. And I think, the key to making this incredibly rapid technological transformation go well will be drawing on those traditions that speak to the constants to help us manage the rapid change.
The book is called Should You Choose to Live Forever? A Debate. Stephen Cave, thank you very much indeed for speaking to Reading Our Times.
Thank you, Nick. It's my pleasure.
Next week, I'll be speaking to Mark Rowlands about his book, Can Animals Be Persons?
So language transforms our experiences into forms that animals could not have. I think that's quite likely to be true. But it's a non sequitur that from that it follows that animals are not persons unless you can show these new ways of experiencing an essential of personhood. And that's the argument I've never seen.
You've been listening to Reading Our Times from the think tank Theos. It's produced by Phil Bodger. Our team includes Daniel Turner, Fiona Hanscom and Chinny MacDonald. Special thanks to Nina Humphreys, who composed our theme tune and all the music. You can subscribe to Reading Our Times on Apple Podcasts and Spotify, and you can also find us on the website theosthinktank.co.uk. We're going to be doing a few live events at festivals in the coming months, so please sign up to the Theos monthly newsletter and join us in person for those if you can. And don't forget to rate and review the podcast on iTunes. It'll help other people find it. Goodbye.